It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. And as always, I've got with me my co-host Andy Grabner. And Andy, I got to say, I'm really excited about our guest today because I thought she was dead. I thought she died of a heroin overdose, or maybe not a heroin. I don't know how she died, but famous, very, very famous person, performed with Lou Reed, performed with the Velvet Underground, performed with, at the Factory, Andy Warhol. Mm-hmm. I'm just really amazed we've got this guest today. I'm not going to go ahead and introduce. We can still do some banter, but I just got to get this out of the way because I'm just really, really excited, and I'm really hoping to see how many people I stump with my not too obscure, if you're into music reference, but very, very pivotal and groundbreaking band she joined for an album, and it just amazes me.
Yeah, me too. Because
what I'm talking about, right?
No. But I'm pretty sure I will learn something once I figure out what you're talking about.
Does our guest know any?
I don't know. Let's ask her or him, or I don't know. The reference doesn't make sense. But actually, let's bring the guest in. Nico Meisenzahl. Hi, welcome to the show. Servus. I would say servus to you. If we would keep this in German, we don't keep it in German because then we would confuse Brian as he just confused me. So Nico, welcome to the show, and introduce yourself and let us know what your connection is with US 60 years, like music from the 60s.
Hey, everyone. To be honest, I have no idea.
I figured as much.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Nico performed with a band called the Velvet Underground. You might have heard of Lou Reed. No? Take a Walk on the Wild Side. Velvet Underground was a very groundbreaking psychedelic garage rock band. They influenced Pink Floyd early before that started. It was came out of Andy Warhol's System and Junk, and
So, but the name reference of this artist, Nico.
So Nico, yeah, she that's not her given name, but that was her performer name, and she joined them. Warhol was really into Nico, and he said, hey, you're going to do an album with the Velvet Underground. And since he was their manager, he made it happen. It's one of their most famous albums with the Andy Warhol banana on the cover. So anyway, when I first saw the name, I was thinking, maybe somehow Nico's, but we have a much, I think, considering that the performer Nico is dead, I think the modern performer of Nico, and I'm not going to even try your last name though, probably going to be a lot better conversationalist, because I don't think Nico would have much to say. The other one, right? Yeah. Anyway, this is the dumbest intro ever. I think I get the award for the dumbest.
Well, most likely. Andy? And I think let's make sure we shut up and give Nico the chance now to introduce himself properly. Nico, who are you?
Introduce
yourself to the audience. Everybody.
I'm the other Nico. So Nico Meisenzahl. I'm doing DevOps-related topics in the Cloud Native, Kubernetes, Azure ecosystem. We're basically helping our clients and customers to get started in the cloud, or to get faster, better, more secure.
Mm-hmm. And if I look at your LinkedIn profile, so maybe people could have guessed from your name and your accent, you live in Germany, southern Germany, in Bavaria, and based on your LinkedIn profile, which we also link to in the description of the podcast, doing cloud native Kubernetes and Azure at White Duck. You're doing a lot of talks as well, and I think this is also what kind of get the conversation started, because the cloud native space and the DevOps space is a huge space, and it seems it obviously covers everything from dev to ops. With we talk a lot about site reliability engineering, we talk a lot about chaos engineering. All these topics fall into. The topic that interested me for today's talk is more focusing around security, especially in the cloud native and the Kubernetes environment. And you had, I think you probably had different conferences where you talked about this, but it was called Hijacking a Kubernetes Cluster. I walked through the latest presentation I have open, and we'll also link to your slide share, is from the ContainerConf 2022. And for me, the title itself, hijacking a Kubernetes cluster, is cool. And I saw your YouTube recording, and you actually went through and you went step by step into going into the cluster. For starters, Nico, have you seen kind of more security awareness now in the Kubernetes and the cloud natives space, especially since last year when we had it's actually 1.5 years ago almost, 14 months. Log4j, right, is on everybody's mind still, kind of. But have you seen any improvement in security awareness in our industry?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Though I would say in our cloud native bubble, yes. So basically, if you're in the bubble, I think more people are talking about security, DevSecOps, and stuff like this. But in the real world, many customers, clients, companies are not really thinking about that. And this is also why I created this talk, I think 1 or 2 years ago, because I went to clients doing workshops and some new environments, and basically Kubernetes cluster, which are created some years ago, deployed something in there, no security in place at all, no policies, nothing. And then I thought, okay, maybe I should build somehow a talk showing how easy it can be. And to be honest, it's just some basic thing, though I'm not a security person or so, just doing also a little bit of security. So it's nothing fancy, just basic stuff, and it can be pretty easy to get in the cluster. And mainly did the talk to raise some awareness, because somehow it looks like it's still needed.
It's still needed, yeah. And I think this reminds me a little bit, and Brian, we had so many sessions about our most favorite performance problem pattern, the N+1 query problem. And I think it often starts with somebody's writing a small app, right? And it becomes like a little tool and it works. And then all of a sudden this tool becomes popular and more people are using it. The data behind the scenes becomes bigger. And all of a sudden the N+1 query problem really becomes a problem. It wasn't a problem before. And it sounds like a little similar what you're saying. Somebody years ago started playing around with Kubernetes and probably not somebody with operation experience, security in mind, right? Because you're just playing around with it, and all of a sudden, this Kubernetes cluster from back then is now running in production, and it's not just running that app you built years ago, but now it runs critical business functions. And is that also what you see? Could this be related?
Yeah, it's one part. On the other side, it's just, I don't know, developer team or developer has a need. I need a Kubernetes cluster. Okay, let's go to a cloud provider and click 2 steps and you have a cluster, and I don't know, it's called managed something. But it's somehow a little bit managed, but it's not fully managed, not fully secure. And you have to invest, and you have to also know the ecosystem, of course, to know what to do. So I think there are many different scenarios, from not having operations, starting small, building up a demo environment, and then it goes production as always. Different pieces.
Yeah, I can see that scenario quite easily,
Yeah.
We all spin them up and experiment, and then suddenly it catches on, and away you go.
Yeah.
And do you actually hit the pause button and say, hey, let's get an expert in here to figure out how to set this up right before we continue? Probably not.
Yeah. And also what I think with the SaaS offerings, right, as you said, it's 2 clicks and you get a cluster, and sometimes you forget even that you have clusters running around. I mean, typically you should not forget, because at the end of the month you get a bill, but if the bill is hard to figure out for what you actually pay, you may still forget it. And then months later, all of a sudden somebody breaks into your Kubernetes cluster that you've forgotten about and never patched and never updated. But what I thought interesting, and I want to point people to slide number 4 in case you're downloading the slides from his talk or from your talk, you brought up, based on your experience, I guess, as well, what you see out there. I mean, it's a Red Hat study, or State of Kubernetes Security Report. But I guess you said earlier, when you come to customers in the real world, you see these things as well. That study highlights the top security problems, right? Why do they actually exist? And it starts with 53% are misconfiguration.
Yeah,
it's great.
Which is pretty easy in the Kubernetes world. So it's so complex. You need to know all the configurations. If you start from scratch, basically starting with the Kubernetes project, many security settings are turned off by default. Also on the cloud providers, it's not that hard, but still, you somehow get an easy access. Most or many security features are not turned on by default. And on the other hand, you maybe misconfigure something test something, forget to reconfigure it again because you don't have infrastructure as code or something in place. Yeah, looks like this is a thing, yeah?
Yeah. Do you have, for folks that are kind of now thinking, oh man, I have this Kubernetes cluster that I started 6 months ago. Do you have like the one or two things that people should look at in whether they have this particular feature turned on or whether it is whether they have security, like enough security in the Kubernetes cluster?
It really depends. So of course you have the Kubernetes level. From my job and my daily business, I would always recommend to get a managed offering. It's not fully managed, but it at least helps you. And then it's really a layer of multiple things. It's your application, it's your ingress, it's the cluster itself, the container image you're using. So we have multiple stages. And I would say if you implement easy best practices, which are easy to find in the internet, and at least pick some of them, for every layer, you are at least better than nothing. So this is not rocket science. It's really about first step, enable all those best practices, or at least most of them to get started. So it's really also a thing which I find really important to really start with those best practices and get somehow of quick wins. Because otherwise you're maybe talking about 2 years about implementing security, doing security project. After 2 years, you have a big list of things you would like to do, but still you didn't implement anything. So really start small, start with the best practices, and then iterate. As we all do in our daily life with all other things as well, or should do.
Yeah, and talking about best practices, you, again, referring to your slides, to the talk, you have listed some best practices in the slide deck at the end. Linking to Kubernetes documentation, like as you said, like implementing a WAF. These are things that, as you just said, it depends on the layer. There's multiple layers in a Kubernetes stack where you can tackle security, but that's great.
Yeah. For example, starting with your applications, make sure that your application code is secure. The code scanning, stuff like this. It's not a Kubernetes related issue, but it's basically the first step. Then making sure your container images are secure, you don't have any vulnerabilities, log4shell, logs for text, and so on. I don't know, implementing Kubernetes policies, for example. So most of the time, Kubernetes policies are seen to implement guardrails in the cluster for the Kubernetes users, which is right. But on the other hand, it also works if somebody gets into your cluster. She also had guardrails to say, okay, I cannot spin up a container with root access or with host pass mounted or something else to make it harder to get further within the cluster. Same with network policies. So many clusters have no network policies in place. Nobody in an on-premise world with a team set or something would say, hey, okay, shut down the firewalls, just starting and sending traffic around. Nobody will do it. Why are we doing it in the Kubernetes cluster?
Yeah. So earlier, and maybe I misunderstood what you were condoning before. Earlier, you had said something about, start small, don't make it a hugely involved process because then you'll never get anywhere. And I'm not saying I need you to commit to an answer and we're going to hold you to it. So don't take it that way. But, my initial reaction would be to, oh, well, maybe that's a great time to go talk to your security person within the organization. It almost sounds like that could be a roadblock then to doing the innovation. And some of these steps that you mentioned here are some of those low-hanging fruit that you can take to just get ahead of that, get things started. And then as it starts taking off, then maybe start including that. But I think maybe your point was that there's a fine line when if you go to the security department in your organization, they're going to be like, whoa, what is this? We got to review this for top to bottom, soup to nuts and everything, right? So did I misinterpret that, or is that where you were?
No. I would say doing both. Of course, talking to the security teams and so on. But basically, these are just default stuff. For example, we in our project just implement without asking somebody because it's just the default line. So basically start iterating on the defaults and the best practices. And on the other hand, of course, if you are an enterprise company, you have a security department, and there are also many small companies out there who do not have any kind of security team or something. Of course, those also need to talk to them, and maybe also doing this with a shift left pattern. So basically really talk to them in the beginning and not, 1 week before going to production with the whole cluster also.
Nico, you were very upfront in the beginning, also in the slides where you say you are not a security expert, right? There's people out there that have, they've been doing security for all their life. But I think you are obviously in the real world and you see things. And also based on the preparation that you did for your talk, do you see kind of what are the typical ways or the most common ways that attackers actually get into your Kubernetes cluster? Is it because nobody did network policies? Is it because of a vulnerability like Log4j? Is it because somebody didn't patch their Kubernetes cluster? Do you have any idea on what are the most common kind of reasons why people get kind of the door into your Kubernetes cluster?
Yeah. So on the good side, I never had a client or a potential client who had any issues with their Kubernetes cluster, security issues. So fingers crossed. But back to the Red Hat State Kubernetes security report, as we see, it looks like it's a misconfiguration of the cluster itself. We have 53% here. Then we have major vulnerabilities to remediate with 38%. So I guess any unfixed versions of Kubernetes itself, of the images, of the running applications, and also 30% with security incident during runtime. So basically really somebody getting into your cluster, and then from there, you don't have any tool, any auditing was can help you detect that one, and from there going further. And going further can be just another container running in your pod, in your Kubernetes cluster, can be any kind of data in your cloud provider or on-premises world, but also can be getting access to resources, compute resources outside of the Kubernetes cluster. So in my talk, I'm doing a demo at the very end where basically get credentials from the underlying Kubernetes identity. In this case, it's Azure, but it also works with all other providers. And then basically using these credentials to spin up, let's say, a virtual machine and mine some Bitcoins completely outside of the Kubernetes cluster itself, which is then getting really, really bad.
And I guess extremely hard to trace, right? Because who would know how an attacker, a hijacker got to these credentials, right? Maybe nobody thought about that it's even possible through a Kubernetes cluster. And then they log into your SaaS platform for your infrastructure, your cloud platform, and then all of a sudden spin up virtual machines and then run all sorts of workloads. Then I can really
maybe get back to the identity of the cluster, but then if you don't have any auditing tooling in your cluster, logging this, the information is gone.
And I think this is also, the more, I'm also not at all a security expert, but obviously I think we all have to become more security aware in our industry these days. And now I more and more understand why, for instance, when we are posting videos and we are posting blog posts with screenshots, we have a lot of great colleagues that always then highlight, and hey, there is an internal name of a machine that you shouldn't have on this screenshot. And I said, and I always thought, why it's internal. But then, if you think about it, if one door somewhere else is open, this door might allow somebody to leverage this information and then get to that machine. And I think this is part of the awareness that where I'm so glad that people like you are actually stepping up and say, hey, I might not be an expert, but I learned something. Yeah. And I think we need to bring our awareness to the community.
There's a parallel there, Andy, with performance even, right? Yeah. Performance used to be in the realm of performance people, right? Who were performance engineers and all that. And as time moves on, developers start becoming a little bit more aware. They're not necessarily becoming experts in it, but they're like, maybe they'll look at their code and be like, oh, it looks like this is set up for an N+1 query. Probably shouldn't do that, right? And same thing with security. You have the experts who know all the deep stuff, but as developers and others are having to fix and remediate and encounter the security issues in the real world, they start becoming mindful of them. And it's that same pattern of now to look, oh, well, what happens do I have firewall on, as you said before? Do I have in our pipeline, do we have a scan going on, right? Do we have some of these simple things that I know about now? I'm not going to be an expert necessarily. I'm not going to know all the deep things. But that mindfulness, it's fun to see this pattern repeating in security as we all become more aware of it. So and I think, Nico, what you're saying is that, you're not being a security expert, you picked up on all this stuff and you've been embracing it and just being mindful and trying to spread it to others, which is exactly what we all went through in the performance side, right? So pretty cool.
Yeah. And I think also in the Kubernetes space, it's so damn fast changing. So if you, I don't know, just relying on Kubernetes to run your workload, run your applications, and have basically a different job, you're just consuming Kubernetes, you can't be up to date with all the changes and all the ecosystem around it. So it's easier for us, I don't know, using Kubernetes the whole day, the whole week. But if you're just consuming it to run your applications and then need to be aware of the whole ecosystem, it's really hard. So I completely understand why there are companies out there who struggle. It's really hard.
In your presentation, I also want to highlight, people always ask for tools. What type of tools can be used for certain things, whether it's about, scanning of your containers, scanning your code base, validating, I guess, whether your Kubernetes configuration is sane or not. You did a really great job also in the slides to highlight and link to all sorts of different tools that people can use. One of the things that I would like to get your opinion on, because for me, again, also not an expert in everything, they talk about SBOMs, so software bill of materials. I hear this more and more coming up in conversations. And, I may ask a very basic question now, but I still want to ask because not everybody knows about it. So why are SBOMs so important? What is the benefit of having SBOMs?
Basically, without SBOMs, you don't know your dependencies, or not really know your dependencies. So maybe you have your dependencies somewhere in the list, package log.js, for example, but the main issue are not your direct dependencies, but the dependencies of your dependencies and the dependencies of those dependencies. You are not aware of them. And with an SBOM, software bill of material, you basically get the whole list of all the dependencies and sub-dependencies, and then basically have an inventory of all your dependencies. And this can help, but it then gets even better if you use this SBOM list and then check against the whole list for vulnerabilities and security issues and so on. And then you have the awareness, okay, maybe a sub-dependency has an issue. I need to be aware of that one. I need to patch this or rewrite my program. At least check, I don't know, for an issue in the corresponding GitHub repo to see if there are fixes, configuration changes you can implement directly, and so on. So basically without SBOM, and yes, it's pretty new. This is also something which is not really out there in the, let's say, real world. Without that, you don't have any insights in your dependencies.
So with this SBOM idea, is this, because the first I'm hearing of this, and it's quite intriguing, and Andy makes me think of like the service flow map and all. We're not talking about downstream services, that we're talking about like within your code, within your bit.
Yeah.
What classes and packages are you importing? What third-party components are you importing? What do those ones then rely on? Right. I remember a while back, Andy, we had something. Some of our workshops required on some JSON parser that was a open source third-party thing, and sometimes you go to run, it's like, oh, that's not available right now. So it's all we're not even trying to tell people at this point, look at downstream services and seeing where they're, because that's the other people's responsibility. You're just saying within your own, everything that you're importing, everything that you're pulling in to run your bits. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So let's say
you're
using
downstream, and I'm like, no, that's too much.
Yeah. So for example, you're using log4j, and log4j has dependencies, and the dependencies have dependencies, and with SBOM you're getting the whole list.
Cool.
And just to kind of finish the SBOM topic, so software bill of materials, but that means there exists tools and repositories where I can say, hey, the log4j version XYZ, I need your bill of materials, and then I merge it with mine, and then I get one list that is accurate for me? Or are these tools then that I need to run during build time that scan all of these libraries and then create on demand? Do you know how sophisticated, like how good the SBOM community or the repositories already are, or the dictionaries, whatever is out there?
So basically, you don't need to do it on the build time, so you can do it afterwards. Works for binaries, works for container images and stuff like this. And most of the tools are just a binary, so you can easily integrate it in your pipeline, run it locally. Now I think Docker Desktop also has an integration. You can do Docker scan or something. So it's really easy to use. I'm not 100% sure. I think they all rely on a database, on a central database, at least for the vulnerabilities, of course, but also I think for the sub-dependencies, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. One might also rely on the different tools here. But yeah, I'm pretty sure they are also not 100%, but at least you have a good list, or 95% more than without a SBOM.
Yeah. If I look through, I know we touched based on Kubernetes policies, but if I look through your slides, it's really great, right? I'm just scanning here, and it sounds like I know what I've done a great preparation for this, but actually I'm just following your lead here. And some very simple things that you highlight here. For instance, Kubernetes policies, enforcing of, let's say, read-only file systems, because if you are running an app and they don't need to write anything, don't even give that container the privilege, because if somebody breaks into that container, then you don't give them write access to a file system where they can potentially do more damage.
Yeah, or at least it gets even harder to do so. So it's basically adding steps to make it harder for somebody who breaks in. And one read-only file system are one of them, because if you don't have them, so basically in the demo I'm starting to downloading tools to make my life easier and stuff like this. Yeah. Not possible if you have a read-only file system, for example.
Yeah, that's exactly. Remember that, and folks really watch it. When you were remoting into the container and then you were downloading helper tools, and as you said, if you have this additional level of security, you will not be able to download any of the helper tools. Yeah. Now you said you are in the situation where you're helping a lot of your customers out there with practical advice, with helping them with the Kubernetes and cloud native and DevOps journey. From a security perspective, besides what we've just talked about, is there anything else that, since you may have started creating that presentation and given this talk multiple times, is there anything else that you learned that you say, hey, if I would do the talk all over again, or if I would build a version 2 of this talk, what else would I talk about?
Yeah, so basically, so I updated the talk over and over. So basically, I don't know, I talked about this multiple times, but every time was a little bit updated. I'm currently working on a new updated version and more focusing not on the hijacking part, but also more focusing on the preventing part. So really doing a deep dive on the tooling, how to use the tooling, how to implement the tooling. So shifting from getting in the cluster to preventing the stuff. Which I here in the slides you're seeing it touch point all the topics, all the tooling, but not doing a deep dive. And this is what I will focus this year on too. And also going into more the Kubernetes side. So runtime protection, as I mentioned, the thing we talked about earlier. If somebody gets into your container or into your pod in your Kubernetes cluster and then goes from there to your cloud provider, grab an identity, and so to really know this, getting an alert, or even just kill the process directly. So if somebody gets in your container, 10 milliseconds later, the process gets killed. And with this, you are totally fine. So really focusing on the tooling out there, and helping people to get started easily with them.
I still like your approach, though, right? It's like what was the movie with? Catch Me If You Can, the story of the guy who was kind of doing all of the fraud, he pretended to be a pilot. It was Leonardo DiCaprio. He was playing the character, right? And in the end, in his life, he basically then became an advisor for, I guess, the FBI or somebody, right? Because if you are the best security expert is an ex-thief, kind of, if you think about it, right? And that's exactly what you're doing. You first figure out how can I break in. And now you know all the ways in, and now you know how to close all of these loopholes or these doors.
Yeah, we had also the idea to match both talks into one session, but then it's long, it would be 2 hours or longer, and really do, getting in, blocking the request, getting in another direction, blocking the request. But never had the option for that one so far.
Looking at your LinkedIn profile and some of the postings you did, I see you have been at ContainerConf 2022. Kubernetes is awesome. I also see, obviously, Container Security Days. I guess is this where you're presenting next?
Yeah. It's coming up in early March, and they're doing the next version of the talk we're talking about. Yeah.
It's a great way. Where's this conference?
In Hamburg. I think it's March the 8th. I think, yeah. So it's basically from the Container Days event, which is every year in September. They're now doing a security version of it, a one-day event.
Looking at your profile again, your official title right now is Head of DevOps Consulting and Operations. DevOps is a topic that we've covered over the years extensively. We had Gene Kim on the call.
I don't recall ever talking about DevOps. What?
No, what? That's because now they call it DevSec BizOps Test SRE something.
Sorry.
I also, that's fine. I'm also interested in one thing. I know in your slides you also had like the infinity loop, but focusing now on DevOps and kind of automating things into the pipeline or into the delivery. Even could you recap a little bit, just high level, if you are advising to a development team or a DevOps team, where does security fit again from end to end? I know we covered it, but maybe an overview again. Where would you strategically place security checks just to make sure we don't forget anything?
Yeah. So basically everywhere. So I would really start. In the coding phase, let's say developer implements a new feature, fixes a bug or something, creates a pull request to, spin up all the validation pipelines to build it, run unit testing, etc. Why not directly also running static code analysis to see if the code is somehow fine? So really shift left, get directly feedback. Do not block the developer, but provide directly feedback. So really on the code level, and it's not related to Kubernetes or anything, really on the pull request phase, run static code analysis. Then, of course, if you deploy it to the dev environment, you could also invest some time in dynamic code analysis. So really against the running instance, for example, running your SBOM scanning, getting your dependencies ready, checking your dependencies and so on. And then, deploying to QA, running end-to-end tests, integration tests, further security tests, and then going to operation. And of course, when you're operating the stuff also, and this relates on your platform, on your tooling, but then also, things like if you go back to Kubernetes, policies, network policies, container runtime security, stuff like this. If you're running on a cloud provider, they have security, DevSecOps tooling, enables those. Also here, we think it would be the first part where you enable security in the runtime, while operation also there. Many clients out there do not do anything, just deploying the stuff. And if they, deploy daily or multiple times an hour, they're getting updated dependencies because they're updating their code. But if they have the life cycle of, 2 months, they maybe do not updates for 2 months. So it's really hard. And then, of course, going into the monitoring phase, also doing their security checks, validating your logs for any things, any requests that shouldn't be there. And from there, starting in the planning phase, if you go the whole DevOps lifecycle, again, and also in the planning phase, think about security. How can we better our security on the code level, on the platform level, and so on, and then starting over again. And maybe not only on the developer side for the actual application code, but also for infrastructure as code, your Docker files, Kubernetes manifests, and stuff like this. So not really limited to the application itself. Check all your code. Yeah.
I think you brought up an interesting point, because when we talk with a lot of our community, our Dynatrace community around runtime scanning, because that's what we do with our agent. And our talk track typically is, hey, you deploy it in production, and at the time of your production deployment, maybe the vulnerability is not yet known, but maybe a month later, right? Like Log4j was there for so long, and so that's why the continuous scanning is good. But you also brought up an interesting point. It could be that you have done your SBOM, your runtime, your container scanning at build time, but it takes you, because of your process takes that long, a month or two until you actually release it into production. And if you don't do continuous scanning afterwards, then you may
don't
miss.
Know it, yeah?
You don't know it.
Good point.
Yeah.
You have to rescan, basically scan at build time, rescan in the registry, and also scan in your Kubernetes cluster to be aware if there's still something running in the cluster. Because you may have in your container runtime, but maybe it's not deployed in your cluster yet, or already upgraded again, and it's an older version in the container registry left. So basically you need to scan in all phases all the time.
Yeah.
And this is where all the runtime stuff really helps in the cluster to get those awareness.
I mean, and I think that bit with the container registry is an important bit, right? Because you're dependent on, you're going to check your code and you're going to check your package and you're going to make sure you're using all the right stuff. And then you're relying that the rest of the pipeline is up to date and is consistent, and that everything you assume is going to make it forward is going to, but unless you build that and do that, you don't know. So if it's going through those checks at every point, if somewhere it's like it's grabbing the base image from somewhere else or based on an older component, at least that'll be caught at that point. And I think I mean, again, that's more of an edge case, but again, how do you know the hardening of your pipeline?
Cool. As I said, we will link to all of your material. Is this your kind of only security talk, or do you have other talks as well that I may have missed? Or is this kind of like your security talk for people that want to maybe know or see more from you on security?
Based on Kubernetes and Kubernetes security, this is the only one at the moment. Oh, wait, it isn't. So we had the talk I'm working at the moment on is an updated version of also talk we did one time at least last year. So basically the preventing stuff. But it should be also on my slideshow. Let me check again.
It's not. It should be awesome. It will be awesome.
It will be awesome.
Yeah, here we go. It was all at Container Days, but on the after a meetup at Container Days last year, which I did with my colleague Philip Wells. And this is basically the first version of the more focus on the prevent stuff side, which we will update this year and make it even better.
Well, I'm just looking through your slide share. That's pretty cool. Meisenzahl, slideshare.net, and again, link will be provided. You got a ton of presentations up there, and especially if you look into some of the older ones. Best and worst practices deploying IBM connections. Wow, you've been doing DB2 high availability.
This is a long time, old world.
Yeah, but that means, are you... So your background is also on kind of the DBA's database. Is that something we can assume or not?
So I started with administrating in the IBM world. So IBM Domino, Lotus Notes, IBM WebSphere, DB2. This is where I started, and then I went over to WebSphere. Then WebSphere Liberty container world started. Then started in the Kubernetes world, started on-premise, then moving over to the IBM Kubernetes service, I think it's called. Then I went into the cloud world, moved over to Azure. I'm doing full-time Azure cloud native stuff, and moved from the ops administration side, I would say in between. So between developers and operations and helping in both sides. Or try to help.
Is Lotus Notes even still around?
It is. So it was Lotus Note, then IBM Notes, and now it's HCL.
Okay. I had a friend way back in the late 90s, maybe. I was still working in television, and he was trying to get me into Lotus Notes, and I was like, looking at it, I'm like, I got no idea what this is. As soon as you said Lotus Notes, my head just went somewhere.
And I see, looking at some of your older stuff, coming back to Kubernetes, you started with a Kubernetes one-on-one talk, which is also always good for folks that are new.
So I guess this one is really outdated.
Yeah, no, but still, I think it's still, when I look at some of the things that you have in there, you talk about node port, you talk about how pods through services get exposed to the outside world. I think there's some basic concepts that are still relevant. When we're talking about Kubernetes one-on-one, I also always want to do a quick shout out to our friend Christian Heckelmann at Wurstsalat on Twitter, because he did a great talk about how not to start with Kubernetes. And that's always kind of my reference story on when people like some best practices on what to do and what not to do. But yeah, cool. Nico, I think for me, this was highly educational, right? Just, I don't want to pretend to be a security expert, but I think we all need to become better in security, and also then kind of echoing what we learn to our community, because everybody needs to become more aware. Looking further into the future, when we want to have you back as a guest, what other topics should we have in mind for you? Because you obviously have a lot of real world experience with your accounts. Any other topics that you want to throw into the pot so that we can pick it up later this year?
Hey, yeah. So basically anything around infrastructure as code, Terraform, Kubernetes related stuff. I don't know, how can I connect my Kubernetes with my cloud provider? So basically, as a developer, for example, saying, hey, I would like to deploy my application, but also want to get a database directly. So like crossplane and stuff like this.
You mean in the real world, there's something outside of Kubernetes where the stuff inside the Kubernetes has to connect with the outside world, like a database?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm forcing our customers to do so, because I don't really like having self-managed databases and stay in a cluster. So basically, we are trying to always use managed databases, and then you need to talk outside. Yeah, so this is one. Let me think. I'm starting in the sustainability world part with Cloud Native, so I'm planning to provide a talk on that one. This year, we have a talk related to Kubernetes is awesome, but so basically telling with real-world example when you shouldn't use Kubernetes, because there are many use cases where people use Kubernetes, but they shouldn't, because they're basically getting all the complexities, but not using the features of Kubernetes. And maybe a little bit security-wise, using OpenID Connect in pipelines to not store any long-life secrets, but basically just using OpenID Connect to grab a one-time token to connect to your cloud provider, for example, to deploy something or to connect to a Kubernetes cluster. These are topics you might see somewhere at conferences this year.
Cool. And maybe, Brian, this is a good shout out for our listeners to say, what do you want to hear? What do you want to hear?
My vote would be for the people who are using Kubernetes that shouldn't be.
Yeah.
That's always my favorite, is when people pick a technology that's just, what did we see? The ecosystem versus the ecosystem, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's always great to hear why it was a good choice, or even just why did you pick that? If you can explain why you chose this and make it make sense, then great.
Because
the best answer so far was because we need to be cool.
That's probably the most common.
To get people, so they have a Kubernetes cluster just because they need to be cool.
Yeah.
I remember, this is now at least 10 years, or maybe even longer ago, when one of our customers came to us and they showed us their new CRM system with high transaction volume, not CRM, e-commerce system that they built with high transaction volume. And they decided to build it on SharePoint because SharePoint tables and views were so flexible, but obviously never designed for any high transactional volume. And we basically had to then tell them that the 2-3 years effort that they put in is all for nothing because they just made a wrong architectural decisions in the beginning. And I think the decision back then was also they knew SharePoint and how easy it was to build new screens, but nobody ever thought about whether it's the right pick from an architectural perspective. And
yeah, wow. It's almost like they're building it in Lotus Notes.
Yeah. All right, Brian, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, sure. One thing I always that fascinates me with all this is every time we hear about this kind of stuff, especially the Kubernetes topic, it really reinforces the fact that when people think, oh, let's move to Kubernetes, to me, Kubernetes is a software-based data center, right? And most people, I think of it as, it's something for me to run my code on. Well, your data center is something for you to run your code on. But yeah, you do have a data center where you're running this stuff on, but now you're managing all your infrastructure, you're managing all your network, you're managing all of your code, you're managing everything all in one. And it's forcing everybody to become so much more aware of all those other layers. We used to have those, I'll say nice in quotes, but we used to have very walled off sections, right? Infrastructure, they just worried about the infrastructure. Developers never worried about the infrastructure. And as you go into these platforms like Kubernetes, you can't have that approach anymore. Same thing now goes obviously with security, right? You have to be aware. What happens if somebody gets in? Are you exposed? Can they get into your component and wreak havoc because you're not paying attention or thinking of the ecosystem? It's a much broader mindset that you have to have in these areas, which also makes it a little bit more difficult. But I think, the icing on the cake here, or not the icing on the cake, the promise is that with really well automated systems, right, if you really, really embrace the automation potentials in these systems, there's a lot of things that you would have to worry about that you don't anymore, right? Which JVM am I going to use? How much memory am I going to give it? You can automate these systems so that you don't think about these things. You can start building in opinionated platforms into your systems. You can do it so that you can focus on your code, focus that you have these other things, and a lot of the other areas that you used to have to focus on are now just part of the system, which is the beauty of Kubernetes being a software infrastructure, if we want to look at it that way. So there are the trade-offs, there are the ways to handle it, but it really requires that maturity to go into those systems and really start setting them up properly so that you can now focus on the more important things like your code and is my code secure and is my code performant. So it really gives you that ability, but it is a shift in mindset and a shift in way of doing things. Anyhow, that's what was going through my mind a lot as you were talking about this and making sure that so many more things that let's say a developer even has to be aware of. It's hard for a developer to have to do this stuff, right? And they shouldn't necessarily have to do this stuff, but that's the ecosystem. But again, if you can remove those additional components that they used to have to take care of, that frees them up to start looking at some of those other things. Anyhow, Nico, thank you very, very much. I hope we got everything in that you wanted to talk about. If you have any last minute shout out, if you want to thank your puppy for or whatever. Go ahead.
All good here.
All good there.
Thanks for having me. So I think we rounded up everything.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to all of our listeners. And if anybody has any comments on what they want Nico to talk about next time. Oh, I do want to say I took a quick look, Nico, the German artist, I should say, did not die of heroin overdose. She died of a bicycle accident. But I think there was a period in there. So just be careful riding your bike, Nico, and wear a helmet.
Will do.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Talk to you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.